It is the 3rd of November, 1942. Warsaw is under occupation. The streets are dark, the curfew absolute, and the penalty for what Krystyna Wituska is about to do is death. She is 19 years old. She is wearing a plain cotton dress, a borrowed winter coat 2 sizes too large, and the kind of expression that young Polish women had learned, through bitter necessity, to perfect. Blank, unhurried, entirely unremarkable. Sewn into the lining of the coat, pressed flat between 2 layers of gray wool, are documents that could end the war in Poland's favor. Operational intelligence, troop positions, cipher keys, the names of German officers who had been turned, and she has to move them across the occupied city, on foot, alone, past 14 separate Wehrmacht and Gestapo checkpoints before 4 o'clock in the morning. She does not run. Running is how people die. She walks. And what she carries in that coat, and what she endures to deliver it, represents one of the most audacious acts of individual courage in the entire history of the Second World War. A story the Nazis tried to erase, a name that deserves to be remembered. By the autumn of 1942, the German occupation of Warsaw had entered its most brutal phase. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising was still months away, but the systematic destruction of Polish civil society was already well advanced. The Gestapo had established an extensive network of informants, checkpoints, and surveillance operations across the city. Moving anything of intelligence value, documents, photographs, cipher materials, radio components, through the streets of Warsaw had become, in practical terms, nearly impossible through conventional means. The Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army, was the largest resistance organization in occupied Europe. At its peak, estimates suggest it comprised between 300,000 and 400,000 members across Poland, though precise figures remain difficult to establish, given the deliberate fragmentation of its command structure for security reasons. Its intelligence wing, known as ODL-2, was producing some of the most valuable strategic intelligence reaching London and the Western Allies, including early documentation of the V-1 and V-2 rocket programs at Peenemünde, and detailed reports on the extermination operations at Treblinka and Auschwitz. The problem was not producing the intelligence. The problem was moving it. German security operations had systematically compromised conventional courier routes by late 1942. Mail couriers faced near-certain detention at checkpoints. Military-aged Polish men on the streets of Warsaw after dark attracted immediate and lethal suspicion. Radio transmission was possible, but carried catastrophic risk. German direction-finding equipment could locate a transmitting set within minutes. What the Armia Krajowa needed was a different kind of courier entirely, somebody the Wehrmacht and Gestapo had not yet learned to look for. The solution that emerged from the Armia Krajowa courier network was elegant precisely because it exploited a blind spot in the German security apparatus, specifically the assumption, common among German occupation forces, that young Polish women were unlikely to be carrying anything more dangerous than a shopping list. The courier system that developed across Warsaw from 1941 onward was built almost entirely on this assumption, and on the extraordinary courage of the young women who weaponized it. Krystyna Wituska had joined the Armia Krajowa in 1941 at the age of 18, recruited through a network of pre-war university contacts. She was trained in document concealment techniques developed by ODL-2 specifically for urban courier operations. Materials were never carried in obvious containers. Documents were pressed flat and sewn into coat linings, hidden inside false-bottomed shopping baskets, folded into the pages of ordinary books, or, for the smallest and most critical items, written in a miniaturized hand on tissue paper thin enough to swallow if necessary. The concealment of cipher materials required additional precautions. Cipher keys were typically written in a water-soluble ink on paper treated to dissolve within 4 seconds of contact with saliva, a technique developed at the Armia Krajowa's clandestine technical workshop on Lwowska Street in Warsaw. The workshop, which occupied the basement of an apparently ordinary residential building, also produced forged German identity documents, official stamps, and travel permits of sufficient quality to pass visual inspection at a checkpoint. Each document set prepared for a courier was tailored to a specific cover identity: a domestic worker returning from a night shift, a nurse leaving a hospital, a factory employee with a late pass authorized by a German employer. Every element of the cover story had to be internally consistent, memorized completely, and deliverable under direct interrogation without hesitation or variation. On the night of 3rd November 1942, Wituska's cover identity was that of a hospital laundry worker returning to her lodgings after a double shift. Her documentation was forged. Her route had been memorized across 14 checkpoints. The documents and her coat lining detailed the positions of 3 German armored divisions and the schedule for a forthcoming security sweep of Warsaw's southern districts. Accounts of that night come primarily from Wituska's own letters, written later from Gestapo detention at the Alt-Moabit prison in Berlin, and from the post-war testimony of her Armia Krajowa handler, whose identity remains partially protected in the Polish Institute of National Remembrance archives. What is documented is that Wituska completed the crossing, all 14 checkpoints, alone, on foot, in just under 4 hours. At the 9th checkpoint, near the junction of Marszałkowska and Aleje Jerozolimskie, a Wehrmacht sergeant detained her for 11 minutes, examining her forged hospital documentation under a torch and asking repeated questions about her employer. She answered without variation. He released her. She walked on. The documents were delivered to a dead-drop location in the cellar of a bakery on Złota Street before 4 in the morning. They reached London via the Armia Krajowa's courier chain to neutral Sweden within 6 days. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The German occupation forces eventually developed countermeasures against the female courier network, though doing so took considerably longer than it should have, a reflection of how effectively the Armia Krajowa had exploited the initial blind spot. By mid-1943, Gestapo operations in Warsaw had identified the general pattern of young women as primary document couriers and had begun systematic searches of female pedestrians at major checkpoints. The Germans deployed female Gestapo auxiliaries specifically for this purpose, since male guards could not conduct thorough physical searches of women without creating procedural complications. The NKVD, operating its own networks in occupied Poland, used a broadly similar courier system, but with significantly less sophisticated document production capability. NKVD couriers in Warsaw during the same period were generally equipped with forged documents of lower quality, and their detection rate at German checkpoints was correspondingly higher. The British Special Operations Executive, parachuting agents into occupied France and the Low Countries, trained their female agents in concealment techniques derived partly from intelligence shared by the Polish networks, a direct transfer of methodology from Warsaw to Western Europe. Krystyna Wituska was arrested by the Gestapo on 17 March 1943, not at a checkpoint, but through an informant within the courier network itself, the most common cause of courier captures across all occupied territories. She was transported to Alt-Moabit prison in Berlin, where she was interrogated for several months. She gave nothing. She was tried by a German military tribunal, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to death. She was 20 years old at sentencing. She spent the following year writing letters from her cell, to her mother, to friends, to fellow prisoners, letters of extraordinary composure and clarity that were secretly preserved by sympathetic prison staff and eventually published in Poland after the war. They remain among the most remarkable documents to emerge from the occupation period. Krystyna Wituska was executed by guillotine at Alt-Moabit prison on 26 June 1944. She was 21 years old. The intelligence she delivered across those 14 checkpoints in November 1942 contributed to Armia Krajowa operational planning that saved an estimated several hundred lives in the subsequent security sweep she had reported on. Surviving records of the Armia Krajowa courier network are held at the Polish Institute of National Remembrance in Warsaw and at the Sikorsky Institute in London. Wituska's letters were published in English translation in 1982 under the title I Am Afraid of No One. Return for a moment to that Warsaw street. November darkness, a curfew that means death. 14 checkpoints between one cellar and another, and a 19-year-old girl in a borrowed coat walking at exactly the right pace, not too fast, not too slow, carrying in her lining the kind of information that armies spend millions of pounds and thousands of lives attempting to obtain. She had no weapon, no radio, no support vehicle, no extraction plan. She had a forged document, a memorized cover story, and the ability to look a Gestapo sergeant in the eye for 11 minutes and give him absolutely nothing. She crossed 14 checkpoints. She delivered the documents. She walked home. She did it again the following week, and the week after that, for months, until the network was broken from the inside by someone else's weakness, not her own. The Nazis executed her because they were afraid of what she represented. A 19-year-old girl in a borrowed coat was more dangerous to the German occupation of Warsaw than a tank battalion. And she knew it. That is why she kept walking.